Okay, so we took a look at creating a circle skirt with a single seam in center back. Now let's look at creating a circle skirt with multiple seams. More than 1, 2, 3, 4, however many seams you want, but more than one seam. I'm going to go ahead and delete my other circle skirts from the previous video. And follow along for this next one. I also want to get rid of any points of measure. I don't need those. Okay. I'm just deleting these points of measure that were sitting up here. You may still have some, that's fine. So, circle skirt with more than one seam. Using my edit pattern tool, I'm just going to verify I've got a 29-inch waistband. Yours might be different depending on the size of your model or the size of your dress form. I'm going to take that 29 inches and subtract 1 inch for stretch because everything will be cut on the bias for that waistline on the skirt. Get my ellipse tool that's hiding underneath that polygon tool. Click and hold and you'll find the ellipse tool sitting right there. Click once in the 2D pattern window and create a circle with a circumference of 28 inches. That's my waistband minus 1 inch for stretch. Click OK. So there's my waistline, and now I'm going to, using the edit pattern tool, make sure that ellipse is selected, right click on one of the edges and choose offset pattern outline. And just like I did in my previous video, I was going for a 10-inch length on my skirt on half scale. So I doubled that to 20 inches for full scale. So extend 20 inches, your measurement may be different. Keep the number of offsets as 1 and create internal line is checked because I want to trace this circle to an internal line so I can then convert it into a hole. Click OK. Same thing as we had before. But note that I did not include any seam allowance when I calculated the size of this internal waistline circle. I just took my waistband, subtracted for stretch, 1 inch for stretch, and just drafted this as is. I'm not worried about cutting out any slivers to make room for seam allowance later, and I'll show you why. Transform pattern tool, select that internal circle only. Make sure nothing is selected other than this internal circle. Right click on it, on its edge, and convert to hole. Now we can get rid of that. So it's the same thing as we had previously, except I haven't cut any slivers out, haven't worried about adding any seam allowance or anything. Just as we did before, I'm going to go to a side view with the number 4 or 6 on my keyboard, rotate this around this red rotation gizmo so it is horizontal. I'll go to my top view and drag this over so it's centered on my girl here, and forward facing view number 2 on the keyboard, and drag this down towards her waistline. I'm going to go ahead and sew this skirt to my waistband. I haven't added any seam allowance, haven't put any seams or anything in there. I'm going to use my free sewing tool just like I did last time. Click once here, ignore the extension, that's not going to be included. Click again on this end here. And now I got to test to see which direction I need to sew this. I'm going to try this way. See if that worked for me. Let me turn off my girl here. See that my lines are not crisscrossing. That's looking pretty good. Okay, cool. And simulate. Pull this through her hands as usual. All right. It's the same as we had before, we just don't have a seam anywhere. Not yet, though. Now, the cool thing with working with this kind of pattern, which is more than likely what you'll have for a full-scale garment, you're not likely to cut a circle skirt out of a single piece of fabric with only one seam in the back. It's hard to find a large enough piece of fabric to do that. So you will more than likely have 2 or more seams in your circle skirt when you're making it in full scale. In half scale, sure, we can have a single seam because it's a tiny pattern, but in full scale, you're more than likely to have 2 or more seams. So I'll show you a few ways that we can add seams to this skirt. We've already attached it. Everything's looking copacetic, except for these little polygons that are bundling up on themselves. A couple of ways we can add our seams. We can work with this in the 2D window. I've just moved to the back view of our girl here. I'm going to go to my internal polygon line tool here in the 2D window. And just as I did before, I can click once on this vertex and double click on that vertex to create a seam. You'll see it shows up in center back here. I can also click and double click on either of these points. That'll create side seams. Let me turn those on. There's my internal lines. You can see there's that internal line there. There's the other one over there that's currently highlighted. There's my center back right there. We could also add a seam to center front if we wanted. Now at this point, these are just internal lines. They're just kind of marking out where seams are going to be eventually. And with the edit pattern tool, I can shift select all of those lines, cut and sew. It will automatically cut through the pattern, space them apart a little bit, and sew them back together. So there's already sewing relationships added in there. And now I've got 4 seams. I can simulate one more time just so you can pull that all together. And you can see there are now 4 seams in there. If they're a little hard to see, I can turn on my schematic render, and there they are. Those thin lines, 2, 3, and 4 seams. So it's a lot faster, a lot easier to do that rather than having to calculate in your seam allowance for a single seam. And now we've got plenty of room to move all these pieces, space them apart from each other, and then for our final pattern, I can just add seam allowance all the way around them, 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch, however much I want. And we've got plenty of space. We don't have to worry about calculating extra space for a single seam like we did before. Now that's one way to add our seams. I'm going to undo this a couple of times so we can see a couple more ways to do this. Now we can always draw straight lines. That's easy enough. I showed you the edit curve point tool in the last video. You can add curve points into here if you wanted to modify what your seams look like, if you wanted to add a curve to them for whatever reason. You can do the same thing with the edit curvature tool. The edit curve point tool adds these little orange dots to control the curve itself. If you're more accustomed to working with Bezier curves like in Illustrator, you may want to stick to the edit curvature tool. That's the letter C for your keyboard shortcut. You can click and drag with the edit curvature tool. It does not add any extra curve points. You'll notice there's no extra orange dots on here. But when you use the edit pattern tool and click on that curve, you'll notice we get these Bezier handles. You won't get Bezier handles if you're using the edit curve point tool. This is assuming you're actually using these individual curve points to modify the curve of the line. The edit curvature tool, however, will give you Bezier handles. So if you prefer to work with these, stick with the edit curvature tool. If you prefer to have the points to add and delete and change, you can always right click on them with the edit curve point tool and delete them if you want to. Just know that there's 2 options for doing that. Now you can always add a curve point to lines that have a curvature that have been modified with the edit curvature tool, but you lose those Bezier handles once you start putting those curve points in there. And the same thing, you can select these. Even if there's a curve on these lines, you can select them, right click, cut and sew. They'll do the exact same thing, create those curved seams for you and stitch them back together for you. So you can go in here and add as many seams as you would like with your internal polygon line tool. You can place them wherever you'd like. They don't have to go between vertices. As long as you click on one edge and extend it to another edge, it'll create an entire seam that you can then select, right click, cut and sew. So I've added some strange seams back here in the back now. And of course you can add curvature to them and modify them however you'd like before you cut and sew them. There are other means of adding seams and style lines to your garments that we'll look at in another video. I do want to show you again that even here, if I use my edit curve point tool, there you see all those curve points again because I extended the outline of this internal circle, it's now added all these extra curve points. So just a reminder, you can use the point of measure tool to click and double click to find the full size of this circle. This is a smaller circle skirt, so mine is 49 inches. So I can redraft this without having to do all those measurements. 49 inches wide, okay. My internal ellipse tool, again, click and hold on the polygon line tool, internal polygon line tool, and my internal ellipse tool. Hover towards the center and let those dotted lines snap into place. Single click and place my waistline in there at 28 inches on the circumference. Select that internal circle only, convert it to a hole. So now we don't have as many points to have to worry about. So don't forget that point of measure tool. That's going to be really important when you're making your tech packs and things, that you can take measurements from just about anywhere. And it helps you if you don't want to do all the math of figuring out the radii or diameters for how we're drafting your circle skirt. Just draft it this way. Just extend it however you'd like, and then measure it and redraft it so you don't have to worry with all of these points. I'm going to go ahead and delete this one and replace it with this one, just so you can see that rotation. Number 5 on the keyboard. Drag this into place. Number 2, and drag that down. And then free sewing tool, click once, click again, click here, hover around, click again, simulate, and pull that through her hands. So what happens if I want to make this into a handkerchief skirt? There's a multitude of ways to do this. I'll show you 2 methods for doing so. We already know that this circle skirt is 49 inches wide, so I could essentially draft a new pattern using the rectangle tool, that's S on your keyboard. Click once and make that 49 inches by 49 inches. And still internal ellipse tool, snap to the center, single click, 28 inches for the waistline, transform pattern tool, right click that circle, convert to hole. Now I've got the starts to a handkerchief skirt. If I were to add this, I'll show you just a moment. I'm going to show you one little trick here. I'm going to move my circle skirt out of the way and drag my handkerchief skirt into place so you can see what that looks like. To do that, I'm just going to drag this over. Now, I've moved this over here, but it's still got sewing relationships to my waistline. There's a few things you can do to fix this. You can right-click on any pattern piece and choose Freeze. That will freeze this in place, but the sewing relationships are still active, meaning this waistband is going to try to stretch its way over to my skirt, and I don't want it to do that. So instead of freezing that, I'm going to undo that. I'm going to right click on this circle skirt and choose Deactivate Pattern and Sewing. Deactivating the pattern only is similar to freezing. It won't freeze it in place. It'll keep it from moving, but it's not going to deactivate the sewing relationships. I want to choose Deactivate Pattern and Sewing. My pattern will turn transparent. My pattern piece will turn transparent to let me know that it's no longer being affected by the simulation. And my sewing relationship lines no longer have a color to them. They're now white. That is letting me know that these sewing relationships are not going to be affected. And I can simulate, because I don't want this to fall down. I'll show you what happens when I simulate. Waistband's going to stay where it is. This is going to fall because it's still being acted upon by physics. But this doesn't have anything. It's not dragging the waistband over. It's not trying to snap its way back into place or anything. Let me undo that. Now this piece, I don't want it to fall to the ground like that. Let's say I'm testing something. I can right click on it. I can freeze this. I'm not worried about any sewing relationships getting dragged into weird places because it's not sewn to anything. And then if I simulate, nothing will happen. This is now frozen, so physics are not acting on it. Gravity doesn't happen for this piece. This has been deactivated, so my waistband isn't trying to snap over to it. So there's a couple of different ways to freeze pieces in the 3D window. But I do want to put this handkerchief skirt into place, so I'm going to go to my side view, rotate it horizontally, top view, drag it into place, front view, drag that down, And I will sew this together, same way I did before. Oops. There we go. And because this piece is frozen, notice what happens to the waistband. My skirt piece is currently frozen, the waistband is not, and there is an active sewing relationship between the two. If I simulate, you'll see my waistband, it has a hard time. It's currently trapped. It's stuck to that measurement at the waistline. Now my facing is phasing in and out of itself and doing all kinds of weird stuff. So I'm going to undo that. And select my skirt, right click it, and unfreeze it. Now it should work perfectly fine. Again, it's going to phase through her hands. And now we have the same size of skirt. It's a little bit longer because we have these corners from the handkerchief that create a very different kind of hemline. So that's one way of doing your handkerchief skirt. Get your measurements from your circle skirt and redraft it. Or I'm going to drag my circle skirt back into place and right click it to activate it. So it's now active again. I can modify this circle skirt just like I can move all these little curve points and whatnot. I can also manipulate this into a handkerchief skirt. I want to, because my handkerchief skirt needs to be a square, I want to get rid of these curves all the way around here. I can use my edit curvature tool and select my curve points, delete them, right click and delete them. So that gets rid of all the curve points. Another tool I can use is the add point or split line tool to add a point to that line. And with my edit pattern tool, I can drag that point back out. And you'll see it snap. Once it snaps to one of the horizontal or vertical axes of another point, you'll see that line turn pink. And there it snaps. Now I've got a corner on that point of my skirt. So now this little edge has become a handkerchief skirt. And I can do that for all of those corners. Again, edit curve point. Select my curve points, make sure those are selected, right click on any of them, delete, split line, add point, split line tool, and then edit pattern tool, drag that point out until it snaps horizontally and vertically. Another way you can delete all of your curve points or curvature, whether you've used the curve point tool or the curvature tool, instead of having to go and choose this particular tool, you can just use the add point split line tool by itself. You can just add a point anywhere on that curve, and then while it's selected, delete it. I'll show you that one more time. You can, on any curves, whether it's been modified by the curve point or curvature tool, you can use the add point split line tool to click add a point to any point of that curve. While that point is still selected, it's still active, it's yellow, just delete it. That'll get rid of all of your curve points. You can do the same thing here, delete that. Now we've got a completely different shaped skirt, creating a very curious hemline that you can play around with as well. And if I wanted to, I can add that point back in. Z on my keyboard for my edit pattern tool, snap those points back into place. X is your keyboard shortcut for the split point, add point split line tool. Back to Z for the edit pattern tool, and then I can drag that point out. So remember, anytime you want to modify a point or an edge, use your edit pattern tool. That's Z on the keyboard. And now we've got that same handkerchief skirt that we drafted earlier, and we don't have a whole bunch of curve points to have to deal with. You can also create tiers. So you can add tiers to your circle skirt or your handkerchief skirt if you like. That's as easy as copy paste, drag it over somewhere. Get it into place. Sew it into place. Now, whether you sew it to the waistband or sew one tier to the next is up to you. When you're actually making a skirt out of fabric, you would sew your tiers together, baste them together, and then cover the raw edges with your waistband. But with CLO, it's just a matter of just stick it together however you need to. So I'm just going to sew one layer to another around the waistline, and I'm going to simulate. Now we've got multiple layers, and you can see what happens when we start adding those layers. There's kind of some confusion from the system as to which polygons need to sit on top of another. So to help us, we can tell the system which layer we want to have sitting on top of another. I'm going to modify, just going to use my edit pattern tool to delete those points in the middle. I don't need those anymore. And I'm just going to modify this layer here, make it a little bit smaller. I don't want to affect my waistband, my waistline. If you use the transform pattern tool to make any changes like that, let's say we want this to be a smaller square, you have to make sure that we're not, see, once I do this, it scales the whole thing, including the waistline measurement, which I don't want, which is why I'm using my edit pattern tool to drag these edges in. And you can always drag them by a certain amount. While you're dragging, click and hold with your left mouse button. Before you release the left mouse button, you can right click and it'll let you input how far you want to move that distance. So you have a lot more control over it. So now we have a slightly smaller square on top of a larger square. And I'm going to tell the system that I want this square, using my transform pattern tool, I'm going to select it. I want this square to sit on top of this one. So I'm going to select this square. And down here in my property editor, I'm going to choose down here in simulation properties, I have layer. Layer is automatically set to 0. All the pieces will automatically, all the pattern pieces you draft will automatically be set to layer 0. And you can click on this number and put whatever number you want into it. It can be a positive or a negative number. Positive numbers will lay on top of other numbers. So right now, if this pattern piece is set to 0 and I set this one to 1, it changes color in the 3D viewport. It will not render with this neon green color, but it's just telling you this piece has a different layer. It's sitting on a different layer in the hierarchy of pattern pieces. And if I simulate, you'll see this layer, this piece of my pattern, try to merge itself on top of this other pattern piece. It's going to kind of, again, polygons are going to have to kind of figure out where they're going, but you'll notice it has now pushed its way on top of my lower layer. This is great. Using the layer simulation properties is great for when you're working in, you've got maybe a button-up shirt and trousers, and you want the shirt to be tucked into the trousers. You can make the trousers a higher layer. You can make all the trouser pattern pieces layer 1 or layer 2, so it sits on top of the shirt. Or you can place the shirt at a negative number, like -1, -2, so it sinks inside of the trousers. I'll show you one more time what happens if I make this a negative number. Let's say -1, maybe -2, doesn't really matter. It still says this is on a different layer, but now when I simulate, you'll see it try to suck itself back in. So now it's trying to sit on a lower layer than this pattern piece. It's trying to push this larger pattern piece on top of the smaller pattern piece. Again, good for when you want tucked in parts of your garment, petticoats or something like that, when you want undergarments or bustles or something sitting underneath other pieces. You can add layers to it to kind of force one piece underneath another. And I haven't added any seams or anything to these, so that would be the next thing to do, would be to put seams onto all these pieces so you could actually sew them together. And in the next video, I'm going to quickly show you how we add seams and seam allowances.